must learn.
Haji man!
Okay. Well, thanks so much for coming here, Antonio. It's a pleasure to have you from Ulaanbaatar, Mongolia.
That is correct, Ulaanbaatar.
That is so amazing.
I don't like to brag. I don't like to brag, but Ulaanbaatar is the best province of Mongolia.
Oh, yeah.
I don't want to offend anybody, though.
You talked about so much awesome stuff with Todd's podcast that I really would just like to recommend that. I'll put the link to that. But I really want to know more about kind of what you do in Mongolia and how that relates to all the various styles of wrestling.
Sure. Well, my work, I'm an economist. I'm actually a China economist. So I've been working on the trade war since Donald Trump was in his campaign. And that's my main work. And then I teach economics at the university. And then my martial arts odyssey started 20 years ago, 2001, right after 9/11. I started Martial Arts Odyssey, and I just left New York, quit my job on Wall Street, went around the world doing different martial arts and documenting them and studying them. And I'd actually never wrestled. And I did all this documentation on different kinds of styles, published a lot of books and things. And around 2011, I got invited to be a guest judge in the first ever professional MMA tournament in Malaysia. Mm-hmm. And when they offered me that, I said, well, instead of being the judge, can I come and fight? And they allowed me to do that. And that changed my life. And then after that, in that first fight, I wound up wrestling. I didn't know anything. I'd learned to sprawl. I knew how to sprawl. Mm-hmm. And I also knew how to sprawl. I think I just knew how to sprawl.
That's a good start.
It was really funny, man. And I got in this tournament, and I had a reputation as a boxer. And the guy, I guess, was just really afraid. He didn't want to stand up with me and trade hands, so he kept trying to take me down, and I kept sprawling and landing on top of him. Mm-hmm. And I wound up winning the fight. And then suddenly all the newspapers got hold of it, and they're like, oh, not only can he box, he can wrestle too. And I was like, I don't actually know. I just know that one move. But that's it. And that's how my wrestling started from there. And so then from 2011 until now, I've mostly been just doing wrestling, grappling around all different countries in Asia, all different kinds of grappling.
Wow. Isn't that funny how the legend propagates?
Art became life.
Well, nice. But what is the Mongolian style of wrestling, and what could we most compare it to? And how is it kind of unique too?
Okay, so Mongolian wrestling is the art that it's the most similar to is Chinese Shuaijiao wrestling, but I don't know if everybody knows what that is. But the Mongolian wrestling, they call it an open-chested shirt, but basically it's like long sleeves. It's like something you'd wear if you worked behind a grill. They wear long sleeves. There's a rope around the abdomen, and you're allowed to grab this thing anywhere. You're allowed to grab the sleeves. You're allowed to grab it goes behind the neck. You're allowed to grab that. You're allowed to grab the rope. You wear that. You wear briefs, and the briefs are made they're like super strong. Like you can lift two men with the briefs, and so you're allowed to grab the briefs and throw with that. And then they wear these cowboy boots, which are awesome.
Cowboy boots.
Yeah, they're amazing. I love the boots are like the best part of Mongolian wrestling. And
wow.
And the wrestling, that's the number 2 part. The boots are and yeah, so basically the rules though is just that you have to throw your opponent on the ground, and what counts as a throw is any parts of his body touches the ground except for the soles of his feet. Then you've won the fight.
Oh, so if you just kind of touch your knee or your elbow, yep, you win?
Yep. Yeah, so you can't do sacrifice throws. You can't do lateral drops and things like that because you can't touch the ground.
Interesting. I guess that makes sense why there's so many successful sumo wrestlers, because that's very similar.
Yeah, so what happened was the the Mongolian. So yeah, the sumo connection is really interesting for me. And I have never trained or lived in Japan, and I really want to. What's very funny is I've almost never practiced Japanese martial art, but all my heroes, all my major martial arts heroes, are you still there?
Yep.
Okay. All my major martial arts heroes are Japanese. Chigoro Kano, the judo founder, is a huge hero of mine. Kimura is a huge hero of mine. What's his name? Musashi. I mean, Musashi is just, it's like my spirit animal. So yeah, I would love to go to Japan and train. And there's this a connection between Japan and Mongolia. So what happened was there weren't enough young Japanese going into sumo. And so they began recruiting overseas for the first time, I guess, in the 80s. And that was the domination of the Americans, which were mostly they all had some connection to Samoa. They all had connections to Samoa and to Hawaii. I think most of them actually probably listed Hawaii as their home, but they were Samoan. And Akebono being the most famous, but there were 4 Americans that I think there were 3 Yokozuna. You would know better than me. There were three Yokozuna, I believe, and one maybe Ozeki. And then the interesting thing, Akebono in an interview talking about the Mongolians came in the 1990s. And one thing I like about your show, because you're judo, the really interesting connection is between judo and Mongolia. That's how this happened, was that there's a judo association here, which President Batulga, by the way, is a judo champion, and he promotes judo, and they call him the judo president. And he's also officially the president of the Judo Federation, which means the Judo Federation gets more, money and attention and more support than any other sport, probably, in a way. And so there was a coach here that arranged an exchange program with a high school in Japan. I forgot the name of the high school, but it was a high school that was famous for judo. So the first Mongolians that went to Japan actually went there to study judo. And one of them made it all the way to the, at the junior level, the under 18 level, but he made it all the way to the national championships. And I believe he was in this final round of competition, or the round just before the advancing to the final round, and he got injured and he was out. And apparently the injury was so bad he was never going to practice judo again. And somehow from there he discovered sumo. He had never thought about it or known about it or anything. And somebody recruited him for sumo, and he went and lived in a stable, and he became the first Mongolian Yokozuna. And since the 1990s, there have been 3 Mongolian Yokozuna. And in fact, there's only been 4 Yokozuna promoted. 3 were Mongolian, 1 was Japanese, and that Japanese guy retired, I think, within 1 year of being promoted to Yokozuna, I guess because of injuries. So basically, yeah, Mongolians have dominated sumo for the last 30 years. And it's just interesting that the connection came through the Judo Federation and not through wrestling.
Wow. I guess that makes sense when you have the president be a big judo enthusiast, but not the actual wrestling. Wow. That's cool. Interesting. I think the forms of wrestling are so similar, yet they don't always interact.
Right.
I think that a lot of times they have kind of similar objectives, but I was wondering, by each wrestling style has different rules and objectives. Does that tell you anything about like the actual culture? For instance, America has folk style wrestling, which for some reason our collegiate whole academic style of wrestling is different from the rest of the world.
That's just America, though.
Well, yeah,
America.
Yeah,
we have a World Series that the world is not invited to compete in. We have a sport called football where you're not allowed to use your feet.
Oh, okay. Well, I always thought that folk style wrestling, compared to international wrestling, it's more about the turn, the exposure, the angle that somebody goes over, whereas American wrestling, more of a continuous, constant amount of control. So I might be kind of extrapolating a little too far, but I was like, I wonder, is there like any thing by the rules of wrestling that tell you something about the culture, even if it's just something random?
Yeah, no, I'm glad you asked that, and you're absolutely right. And I liked what you just said. You said that the American folk style wrestling is focused more on control. Um, Randy Couture, who's also one of my heroes, four-time Olympian, UFC champion, oldest UFC champion, Randy Couture said that wrestling was the sport where you thoroughly dominated your opponent. And if you beat a guy in a boxing match or you beat a guy in a running or swimming or tennis or whatever, yeah, you beat him. But wrestling, you physically dominate that person
Mm-hmm.
and you control them. And this, to me, says a lot about the American culture. That this is, yeah, I mean, it's a very American thing. I mean, at our hearts, at our origins, we are, the pioneers that came over the ocean. We are the Native Americans who tamed the land. We're the cowboys who pushed into the West. And I don't know if you've seen a lot of John Wayne or Clint Eastwood movies, but when
Mm-hmm.
cowboys got injured, they couldn't call 911.
Yeah.
So there's this self-reliance, pick yourself up by your bootstraps. Very American ideals here, and then it reflects in the wrestling. What is Chinese wrestling, for example, or I don't want to say about Mongolian at the moment, but if you look at most of the world, the traditional wrestling. Actually, one of the questions you sent me before this was about if wrestling is a martial art, and that wrestling is the most universal martial art that exists on the planet. Some form of wrestling exists in almost every culture in the world. And the one or two cultures that I'm aware of that do not have wrestling, this relates back to what you asked just a moment ago about how does the culture affect the wrestling. And I actually believe that in Thailand and Laos, because the head is sacred in Buddhism, they didn't want to wrestle. They didn't want to go on the ground with their head. You never want your head to touch the ground. And I've never verified that that's the reason, but I've always suspected that's why they had no wrestling. If you look at Chinese wrestling, most traditional wrestling in the world, 70, 80% of traditional wrestling in the world, the win comes from making your opponent touch the ground. That's it.
This is time for the Judo Know Me podcast.